Our brother Alex Ezeh is here from Drexel, and congratulations again on your anniversary. And we promise you that we are going to help you spoil yourself and your wife, just so we don't get punished for asking you to speak during your anniversary. But Alex is going to speak to us on African institutions and the global research ecosystem. So over to you, Alex.
Thank you, Divine, Isabella. Thank you so much for having me. I think I really feel I'm back to where my roots should be in the social sciences. I've spent the last 20 plus years more in the health area and now at School of Public Health. So that really changes the conversations in many different ways for me. I've been requested to speak on African institutions and the global research ecosystem, and particularly looking at some of the systemic faults in the global research ecosystem that disadvantages African institutions. You will agree with me that the relationship between African institutions and global research ecosystem is quite complex and multifaceted. This morning, we listened to Isabella lay out about 5 different layers of these complexities around these issues, what she called layers in these conversations. And one of those layers is around collaboration. And under collaboration, you have maybe about 4 or so sub-teams around leads and finances and access and rewards and division of labor. You know, I just want to pick one of those sub-teams, finances, and peel it a little bit so we can begin to have some appreciation of the constraints that African institutions work through and some of the paradigms that we use to define these engagements. Let me maybe start off with the year 2018. In 2018, there were about $2 trillion spent globally in research and development, 2 trillion. 0.8% of that was invested in sub-Saharan Africa. In the same year, the total budget, GDP for sub-Saharan Africa was $1.7 trillion, less than the global investment in research and development. And African countries only spent 0.4% of that 1.7 trillion in research and development. So in essence, about 60% of the investments in research and development in Africa in 2018 came from outside. Domestic funding accounted for just about 40% of the total investment in research and development in Africa. So the result of this is the fact that research enterprise in Africa depends largely on external support. This dependence over the past 50 years or so has delivered one consistent outcome: the weakening of local institutions and local capacity in Africa. To be clear, this may be largely unintended, and some people, many have introduced themselves as working within this space of building capacity in Africa. But you look at it, for the last 50 years or so, every single thing we've done in Africa is about building capacity. And we can still look at Africa today and see one of the greatest constraints to its development efforts is capacity. So something must be amiss in this whole conversation. So, while this might be unintended, because the stated goal of many of these initiatives around the continent is to help Africa or to strengthen African capacity. So what is it about external funding that results in the weakening of African institutions? I'll just point to 5 points in the limited time that I have. One is the fact that external research funding in Africa is built on the same traditional model of international development, which is strongly anchored in humanitarian assistance or emergency response. The history of global development institutions is rooted in emergencies. It doesn't matter which way you look. And if you look at it, whether it's the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank and IMF, or the UN agencies, or the major international agencies, you can look at World Vision or Plan, Oxfam, MSF, any one of them you look at and you look at their history, you can always see one particular feature that is there, that they always emerged in response to a major disaster or war. It could be the First World War, the Second World War. It could be the Korean War, the Biafran War. It could be, different emergencies gave birth to these agencies that drive global development. And when you work in emergencies, the goal is to reach as many affected persons as possible with solutions that have been predefined externally using external agencies. Rarely do emergency responses address sustainability or local capacity. And it's, you can't go too far to really recognize what I'm talking about. You can think about some refugees like Zaka refugee camp that's been 62 years old, Dadaab in Kenya that's almost 30 years old. It doesn't matter how many billions you invest in these places. There is no question that we do have many humanitarian situations in the world that do need attention, and we need to be able to respond to those. The challenge, however, is how ubiquitous this mindset is in thinking about Africa's development. So let me leave you with that thought and go to the second point, which is the key consequence of this mindset is the constant narrative of Africa that completely ignores its potential and its agency, discounts its capacity, and reestablishes the dominant narrative of dependency on external actors as the only pathway to achieving meaningful progress on the continent. When you sit outside Africa and say in Europe or North America, and you think about partners in other regions of the world. If I sit in the US, I'm at a US university and I think of partners in Europe at London School of Hygiene or whichever university in Europe. When you think of them, you don't think of them in terms of going to help them and going to support them, going to build their capacity. But when you think of African partners, irrespective of their track record, it's almost always about helping them, building their capacity. And it is like your research projects in Africa can never be funded unless it states clearly that it is going to build the capacity of your African partners. I think Samia talked about attitudes and expectations, and this is what it is about. Being a successful African institution does not require capacity building, is not aligned to this narrative. Put differently, in other regions of the world, you have to be excellent to attract huge research grants. In Africa, you have to be weak and in need to be funded. So these particular sets of expectations and mindset that came out of the development tradition that we have brought into our discourse on development in Africa has created this dependency that and I tell you, I led an African institution that by many instances and accounts could be seen as strong. And I can tell you how many times I have people come in there and look at us and on their way out, look at me and say, you don't need help anymore. And I turn around, I tell them, look, Harvard University with $38 billion in endowment, stop funding it in 10 years, it will disappear. So what is it about this mindset that makes success and building on successful initiatives and ideas and thoughts in Africa quite difficult? So due to the different factors that's beyond this particular talk this morning, external funders have found it easier to support African institutions through what we call subcontracts and sometimes with multiple intermediaries. This funding model ensures that if you give a $1 million grant to a UK or European institution or a US institution, that it can actually result in a $25,000 to $50,000 grant to the African partner. Enough to keep them busy and running around to try to get the data collected and whatever that needs to be done, but not barely enough to allow them to sit back and reflect or to invest in the types of systems and processes that they need to enable them position themselves for the $1 million grant. And that's why we have and continue to have institutions in Africa that, the adjective is fragile, with precarious funding, that many times you look at them, you can count on your fingertips how many of them have budgets of $10 million in a year for research or more, and they are not there. Why is it that when we make calls that target African institutions, we usually think in terms of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands? Why are there rarely calls for Africa-focused research that encourage African institutions to apply in the tens of millions, not even the hundreds of millions that we see in other regions? So the funding model that using intermediaries and sub-awards creates this unequal relationship between the North or home institutions, and I use the North more broadly to any area or region that does give support. And you can think about Korea and KOICA and all of them. It's just using that within those contexts, that in that relationship, it creates this unequal relationship between the home institutions and their African partners. More importantly, it positions African institutions to compete with one another as competitors. And you just have to outshine your neighbor in order to be selected by your northern benefactor institution or partner institution. A World Bank study in 2014 suggested that about 70 to 72% of the research done in East and Southern African countries are with external non-African partners. Only 2 to 3% involve intra-African partnerships. So that's the situation we are in, and that's the situation that many African institutions are operating in. And what it has created and resulted in is the fact that we now have largely African institutions that find it difficult to work with each other. They prefer to work with external partners, even when such relationships undermine their viability as institutions. Changing this requires action at different levels. As African institutions, we have to recognize the changing times and the need to work differently. Even though our countries are poor and have many needs, we still have to make investments in research and development a priority. We may not be able to do a whole lot as individual countries, but if countries come together, they can do more than each of them can do on their own. We know there are several external funders who are genuinely interested in helping Africa. Continuing to support African institutions the way we have done over the years cannot yield any different outcome from what we have seen over the years. There are many African institutions thinking about different ways of engaging with Africa. And I think if we care to look deeper and move beyond our comfort zone in many ways, we'll be able to find those opportunities. I believe in January, we'll be hosting, under the auspices of the African Development Bank, a global community of practice that will work on how to strengthen African knowledge-based institutions. I will share that information with you, Divine and Isabella, so we can actually make it available to the team that is on this go, because that's the conversation that needs to happen and needs to happen now in Africa, and then with our partners outside of Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, for that krinkum krankum. I think it's just good continuation, everyone adding up to each conversation. I'm excited for the conversations and the discussions.